signal. Okay. So we're just going to start with a basic timeline. Most people, I think, the two things that you hear often would be that this is an ancient conflict that started like 2,000 years ago, or that this is something that began in 1948. Both are factually incorrect. And this is just a basic timeline to pinpoint kind of where things started to materialize when we talk about Zionism, which is around 1917. And we're just going to kind of follow through on that. So taking into account the last century leading up to like modern day. So to begin, what is Zionism? The modern Zionist movement is, to put it very simply, a political movement founded in the late 19th century that proposed establishing a Jewish state in historic Palestine. And the term Zionism was coined in the late 19th century by a man called Theodor Herzl. He wrote a book called The Jewish State, and it kind of surfaced in response to rising anti-Semitism in Europe. He basically wanted to establish a Jewish state. It wasn't specific to Palestine, so it wasn't necessarily where that state was to materialize. In fact, when Herzl wrote the book, the favored location was Uganda. So the options that were put on the table were Uganda, Argentina, and Palestine. But Palestine's history offered a justification for colonialism, and it's kind of how things turned out based on what land was acquired and who backed up the Zionist movement later on. And it was very clear from the beginning, from all Zionist founders' writings, that the construction of this Jewish state depended on the destruction of the indigenous society that existed in Palestine. And the destruction of Palestine, therefore, was not an unintended consequence of unforeseen circumstances. The attitude was widely shared. So if we look at the King Crane Commission, which was reported in the UK, investigating in 1919, they concluded that, quote, the Zionists look forward to practically complete dispossession of the Palestinian people. R. Weitz was also quoted to have said, between ourselves, it must be clear that there is no room for both peoples together in this country. There is no other way than to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left. So, obviously the biggest obstacle to achieving the Zionist object then was the fact that there were already people there, right? And this was something that they realized from the beginning, and there were many kind of things written and like meetings had to decide what would be done with the population that was there. And the reality of the situation hampered the Zionist effort to mobilize Jewish and non-Jewish support. So Asher Ginsburg, one of the best known Jewish literary figures in this part of the century, traveled to Palestine and witnessed the destructive impact of Zionist colonization, and remarked that the Zionists, quote, treat the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, deprive them of their rights, offend them without cause, and even boast of these deeds. So when we think about kind of Zionist propaganda at this time too, you can even look up like the posters that were being advertised at this time. Most of them were related to the land and kind of rebuilding or like building, because it wasn't that people weren't necessarily there. It was that everything outside of Europe at the time was seen as uncivilized and for the taking. So the population there didn't necessarily matter because they were not like progressive. So all the posters would be like, let's build this land through Hebrew labor, cultivate it through Hebrew labor. And the slogan that the movement used from the start and continued to use was actually a land without people for a people without a land. So by dehumanizing and denying the existence of Palestinians, Zionists meant to hide the intended victims of their colonization from the world. And they paraded before world public opinion as a national liberation movement of the Jewish people. You hear this rhetoric today too. Zionists have kind of began to appropriate indigenous language and claim that their movement is an indigenous rights movement, when in fact they're destroying an indigenous community, right? And the reason that this was done was so that they could get support from like non-Jews as well. But also back to the whole idea of Europe being the peak of the world. Every territory situated outside of it was empty, not of inhabitants, but kind of constituting a cultural vacuum and therefore suitable for colonization. In 1969, Menachem Begin, who was a prime minister of Israel, warned his audience of the danger of conceding, quote, the concept of Palestine. He said, if this is Palestine and not the land of Israel, then you are conquerors and not the tillers of the land. You are invaders. If this is Palestine, then it belongs to people who lived here before you came. So for both ideological and practical reasons, the Palestinian Arabs had to be cleared from Zionist path People were made to deny the existence of Palestinians, Palestinian identity, Palestinian nationalism, in order to clear way for this movement to continue and gain support. The Zionists proceeded to do this under the cover of the British and their national home policy. So what do we mean by national home policy? Palestine, before Israel was a state, essentially was a mandate under the British, and then before that was a part of the Ottoman Empire since around the 1500s. And we have to understand that during the Ottoman Empire's era, a lot of the regions that the Ottoman Empire had were pretty autonomous. So there were many societies kind of just existing away from Ottoman rule. So they kind of governed themselves. And the Ottoman Empire tried to get more control of these regions over time. There were many clashes. So if you look into the 1700s, 1800s, there are many revolts that took place in different areas that belonged to the Ottoman Empire because they wanted to remain autonomous and not be absorbed into the empire. And that's why a lot of different nationalities and identities emerged, including in Palestine, especially concentrated in the Jabal Nablus region, which is today in the West Bank. So when the Ottoman Empire fell following World War I, the British acquired that land and Palestine became a mandate under the British government. And then the British basically agreed with the Zionists that they would help them. And this was written in the form of a statement in 1917 that we call the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration basically said, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or their rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Which raised the following questions. One, what is meant by a national home, right? How could the Jewish character of a promised state not prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine by default? And what is meant by this promise to facilitate the achievement of this object, right? What does that entail? And to understand this, we have to understand settler colonialism and what that word means. Settler colonialism can be distinguished from the word colonialism because it functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. So we can understand that colonialism is premised around the exploitation of a place, while settler colonialism is more so about the eradication of a place. So it's eradication over exploitation. And common examples of settler colonial states that exist today are the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So we can think about what happened in Israel the same way we can think about what happened in the US. You have a group of settlers that move in, and then over time they develop their own identity and separate themselves from the settlers that originally came, right? So when you hear about the story of the US independence, it's usually framed as the American people breaking away from the British, right? And then the indigenous population is never mentioned. The Israeli independence story is very similar. It's actually about how Israelis gained independence from the British, completely, again, ignoring the indigenous population that existed. And of course, the characterization of Zionism as a colonial project is as old as the Zionist movement itself. This was a characterization made by the Zionist founders themselves. And even under the British government in Mandatory Palestine, there was a Jewish colonization agency that oversaw Jewish settlers moving in over time before Israel was established. So since well before the establishment of Israel in 1948, Palestinians have regarded Zionism as a settler colonial ideology that has sought to expel them from the land with the expansionist aim to claim all of historic Palestine as a Jewish state. So the description of Israel as a settler colonial society thus has a long heritage in the context of the issue, as has the notion that the achievement of the Zionist national project has been predicated on the destruction of a Palestinian one. Now we get to the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, and we use it to talk about what happened in 1948, which is the declaration of Israeli independence, right, and the creation of the Israeli state. So the Nakba specifically refers to the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the British Mandate during Israel's creation. And this took place from 1947 to 1949. What essentially happened was that more than 500 villages were either completely ethnically cleansed, depopulated, destroyed, or massacred. And we have to understand it as a deliberate and systemic act necessary to make way for a Jewish majority state in historic Palestine, which prior to 1948 was overwhelmingly Palestinian. So the reason this came about was because there was a plan approved in November 1947 by the United Nations to essentially split mandatory Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. So from the establishment of British Palestine in 1917 until 1948, there were kind of waves of Zionist settlers moving in. And by 1948, they made up around a third of the population. So the United Nations approved this partition plan without any Palestinian representation. And the reason that was because Palestinians didn't have a government to represent themselves. Prior to the British mandate, there wasn't really a Palestinian state in the way that we understand nation states today. A Palestinian identity existed because of the 500 years of kind of autonomy under the Ottoman Empire. And there was like a rising nationalism from the past century, but there was no nation state in the way that we understand it now, right? So this was kind of all discussed with the exclusion of the Palestinians who made up the majority of the population. And more than 90% of the population of Palestinians were also peasantry. And they lived on land that they lived on for centuries that was owned by a very small minority of like Arab owners. And they were selling these lands to Zionist settlers over time. So the point is there was a partition plan that was announced and Palestinians rejected it immediately because it approximately gave 55% of historic Palestine to the Jewish state. And again, they made up about a third of the population and owned only about 7% of private land. Giving the Palestinian side 42% of Palestine, with Jerusalem being an international city that belongs to neither. After the partition plan was passed, violence broke out and large-scale expulsions began, long before the armies of neighboring Arab states became involved. So after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, after we have 500 villages ethnically cleansed, depopulated, all the massacres, the new state of Israel was declared, and it comprised of 78% of historic Palestine, not the 55% that the UN partitioned for, with the remainder that wasn't taken being the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, which fell under control of Jordan and Egypt until 1967. In 1967, there was the Six-Day War, or the Nakba. The Nakba meaning setback or defeat. And what happened was basically all of Palestine that remained, that was under control of Jordan and Egypt, which is the West Bank and Gaza, fell under Israeli control. And it is that way till this day. When this happened, another 500,000 Palestinians were further expelled from their homes and the territory gained was 3.5 times the size of Israel. This was seen as the moment when Palestinians really felt like they could no longer depend on neighboring Arab countries to achieve liberation, and started to kind of take matters into their own hands. And this war may have only lasted 6 days, but the occupation that followed is now entering its sixth decade. The longest military occupation in the world. With military occupation, of course, comes continued ethnic cleansing, the home demolitions we see all the time, checkpoints, administrative detention, and more. So the first Intifada was a popular uprising against Israel's then 20-year-old military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. It was kind of the first mobilized societal mass uprising. And during the first Intifada, Palestinians employed tactics such as unarmed demonstrations, including rock throwing against soldiers. That's when that became popularized, commercial strikes, a refusal to pay taxes to Israeli authorities, and other acts of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. They are coordinated largely by grassroots ad hoc committees of Palestinians in the occupied territories, and rather than the PLO leadership, which at that time was based abroad, because they kind of started in Kuwait, then moved to Jordan, then Lebanon, then were exiled to Yemen, Tunisia. So they were really disconnected from the people, and this was the first movement that kind of was for the people, by the people. And in response, Israeli soldiers used brutal force to repress unarmed popular rebellion. The defense minister back then, Yitzhak Rabin, who later became a prime minister, implemented a famous broken bones policy, which ordered security forces to break the limbs of rock-throwing Palestinians and other demonstrators. More than 1,000 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces during the first Intifada, including 237 children under the age of 17. It also left tens of thousands more injured. What followed from the first Intifada were the Oslo Accords, which marked the beginning of a bilateral negotiations process. And at that point, that had never been a thing. And this included international mediation monopolized by the US, that would then become model for all subsequent negotiations between Israel and the PLO. So Oslo resulted in creating the Palestinian Authority, which was supposedly an interim self-rule government that governs Palestinian population centers in the occupied West Bank and Gaza under overall Israeli military occupation. And a close examination of the agreements comprising the Oslo Accords and Israeli actions on the ground indicate that Oslo was intended by its Israeli and American architects to cement Israeli control over the occupied territories, while shifting responsibility for policing the Palestinian population from the Israeli army to the security forces of the PA, thus streamlining the occupation for Israel. And the main results, to summarize, were settlements that more than doubled at that point. And when we say settlements, we mean Jewish-only neighborhoods that are built in the occupied territories, the division of the West Bank into separate administrative districts, East Jerusalem practically severed from the rest of the West Bank. So if I'm in the West Bank, then it's practically impossible to get into East Jerusalem. Increased restrictions on Palestinian movement within the occupied territories, so the establishment of curfews, checkpoints, passage closures, and the devastation of Palestinian economy, because now it depended on Israeli tax transfers and international aid. And then we have the second Intifada, or Al-Aqsa Intifada. And this began in September 2000 and was triggered by the Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon's visit, accompanied by 1,000 armed personnel to Jerusalem's Old City, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which most Palestinians saw as an attempt to take control of a noble sanctuary, which was the third holiest site in Islam. Contravening the long-standing status quo agreements at the sanctuary, the gesture was held to be a deep provocation to the Palestinians. And it kind of also arose against the backdrop of the failed Camp David talks, the Oslo Accords, and also a month before the Prime Minister and the PA chairman, Yasser Arafat, had failed to come to a peace agreement. They disagreed over Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return for refugees. So the promised declaration of Palestinian state was postponed, and it erupted again like a mass civil movement. And one of the biggest consequences of this movement was that Hamas took control of Gaza, and Palestinians saw this as a victory because it meant that Israel actually pulled out all existing settlements in Gaza. So Gaza no longer had any settlements, and that ultimately resulted in the blockade that Israel placed on Gaza that continues to this very day. So talking about Gaza, in August 2014, I feel like it's important to talk about Operation Protective Edge, which was this is going weird, okay, which was a military operation that Israeli armed forces basically just bombed Gaza for 51 days. And it was by far the most lethal and destructive in 7 years. And it killed some 2,205 Palestinians, including 722 militants and 500 children. It wounded thousands more Palestinians. Over 18,000 homes were destroyed. Some 470,000 were displaced within Gaza, because obviously there's a blockade there. And large areas of Gaza were essentially razed. And because of the blockade, Israel does not allow Gazans to import the supplies needed to rebuild. So Gaza to this day still looks like it was destroyed the day before. And this blockade also includes just food, just basic things. So they only allow in basic needs for survival. So things like strawberries or chocolate, those things won't pass through the blockade, but you'll get bread, right? So just the bare minimum in order to keep people alive. And during Operation Protective Edge, the Israeli military used imprecise weaponry, artillery in particular, in densely populated areas, leading to huge civilian casualties. So most of the casualties were actually entire families that were killed in their sleep. So if you look at, for example, there's a really beautiful archive online called, what is it called? It's basically a website that has the stories of all these people in Gaza who lost people during Operation Protective Edge. It's called obliteratedfamilies.com. And you'll see that every single family lost at least 5 or 6 members, because it was just concentrated in densely populated areas or in people's homes. And 2 of the core principles of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, are those of distinction and proportionality. So the rule of distinction requires that, to the extent feasible, commanders and soldiers attack only combatants and protect non-combatants and those who are hors de combat. The rule of proportionality prohibits attacks expected to cause loss of life or injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects that would be excessive in relation to the direct military advantage anticipated. And this is kind of an overview to show people what like the map has looked like and changed over time. This is historic Palestine, or what's considered historic Palestine. This is the 1947 UN partition plan that allotted 44% of historic Palestine to the Palestinians. This is the land that was acquired after 1948, so what it looked like in 1967. And the 2020 image is basically what Palestine looks like now. Where the white areas kind of get into the green is where all the settlements are being built. So in the summer, if you were on social media, there was a huge thing about Israel's annexation of Palestine and how that was like supposed to happen. That's been happening, right? All these areas that are covered in white, all these are annexed pieces of land. They're mostly strategic because they kind of cut out like wells or like electricity, like sources like that from villages around them in order to get people to kind of leave. So they build Jewish-only settlements, Jewish-only roads, kind of just cutting into the West Bank. And then these would obviously be built on people's homes that get demolished, which is another way of getting them to leave. And so today, only 15% of historic Palestine essentially belongs to the Palestinians, but it is occupied. Settlements and checkpoints. So we just touched on this, but it's important to know that more than 40% of the West Bank today has been eaten up by settlements, which are actually more like small cities. They're also very cookie cutter-like if you look at them. And since 1967, so the Six-Day War, 221 settlements and outposts have been constructed on Palestinian land with direct support from Israel. And today, over 500,000 Jews are living illegally on Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And Israel has implemented a policy of movement restrictions, including checkpoints, man-made earth mounds, trenches, roadblocks, the apartheid wall, and an intricate and difficult system of traveling permits. The apartheid wall also, the wall that kind of circles the West Bank, was put up in 2005. And it doesn't only encircle the perimeter of the West Bank, but it's actually twice as long as the perimeter of the West Bank, because it does exactly what the settlements do. It kind of cuts into the land and grabs the areas that they know are vital to the villages that are around them. And these restrictions on movements have crippled Palestinian economy, obviously. So Palestinians oftentimes can't get to work, particularly if the wall separates them from their place of employment. And most people have to go beyond the green line to work. And Palestinians also don't have access to quality medical care, and there have been many documented cases of deaths occurring at checkpoints. There have also been around like 63 births at checkpoints because Israeli soldiers will refuse to allow Palestinians through a checkpoint to get to a hospital. Palestinian refugees are the largest and longest lasting refugee group in the world. So from these two groups of people, like the groups that were expelled in 1948 and then 1967, we have around 7 million people living in exile who are documented as refugees. Palestinians actually make up 40% of the world's refugee population, and the Palestinians within Palestine, 74% of them are also documented refugees because they were moved from their ancestral lands into the West Bank or Gaza. Most of the population in Gaza are refugees whose lands are literally right outside of Gaza most of the time. And the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA, was created to deal with the Palestinians who were made refugees after the partition of Palestine and the 1948 Nakba. And that's it for like the main presentation. It's a lot of information, but it's a basic like overview.